Hello and welcome to Coach Talk, the show more interested in ideas and philosophy than facts and history. My guest this week is Pad. He's currently the strategic coach of Vitality in the LEC, but previously worked as an assistant coach and strategic coach at Mad Lions. He's won the LEC 3 times and has been to multiple MSIs and Worlds. We talked about how to scout opponents, how to develop yourself and other coaches, how to peak at the right time, and how the West can be competitive internationally. As well as success and experience, Pad has a thoughtful, human-driven approach to coaching. His passion and care for his players is inspiring. This episode is once again brought to you by Coachify.gg. So for those that don't know, Coachify is a coaching platform that, alongside payments, scheduling, and practical things, makes tools for coaches. You can set up live VOD reviews, anchor your messages to specific timestamps in videos for future use, and even set up the auto-tracking of goals with the Riot API. Now, I understand that learning a new set of tools can be daunting, but with coaching as competitive as it's becoming, anything we can do to set ourselves apart is a fantastic opportunity. While I was working, even in the LEC, I was just using a pen and paper, but I'm old, and the season was much less competitive then, but I understand that it's difficult. But still, now is a good time as any to add something new to what you offer and make it as clear as possible for your players. So if you're interested in checking out Coachify.gg, you can do so with the link below. They have a bunch of free options which I suggest you check out first, although there are extra tools more catered to teams behind a paywall. If you do decide to look into Coachify, please drop me a message on Twitter and let me know your feedback, as we're working together to try and create the best possible tools for coaches. Lastly, if you enjoy this episode, please like, share and subscribe. It really helps. And if you're interested in exploring mentoring or any of the other things I do to support coaches in the scene, follow me on Twitter, where you can find all the other links that you'll need in my bio. And now, without further ado, Pad, what is coaching?
Yeah. I mean, even haven't had time to think about it. I think it's such a large size question. Because for me, coaching is it's a lot of things. Especially when you work with young people the way that we do. Like very often we end up getting players on board that's like 17, 18, 19. So coaching for me is being a strategic coach, being a positional coach, being a big brother, sometimes being a father, other times being a psychologist, even though I'm certainly not qualified for that, or just being, a shoulder to lean on. Um, and I think that's one of the things where Mac and I have had a pretty consistent edge through our, well, Mac for twice as long as me, right? But that's our time as a duo. Is that we view coaching as a much bigger role than just making our players good at League of Legends. We have a big emphasis on making sure that we coach people in communication and how you interact with each other on a personal level, and how important it is that you interact and can exist together on a personal level. Because if you can't, then we've seen many stories in the esports, in real sport, where teams just fall apart because they don't want to work together. So coaching for me is making people the very best they can be, in all aspects of life.
Do you think, I've asked this question to a few people and it's a bit of a strange question, especially so early on. But do you think there's ever a moment where making them the best person is not necessarily the same as the best League of Legends player? And if so, where does which direction do you go?
Yep, I think that's a really interesting question. I think a really good case right now is Vito on our current Vitality team. Like when we got him, he's obviously not a fully complete like League of Legends player yet. There's some facilitators that he's not playing, but in terms of what he's good at in League of Legends, he's one of the best in Europe. So, for example, I haven't had to coach him on Akali a single day because, like, despite being his positional coach, because his Akali is just that good. But helping him understand the importance of communication and body language and personal relationships has been one of our main goals for this split. Well, it's going to be one of the main goals for him this year, because making him a better teammate will eventually translate into making him a better player, because he will be able to transfer some of that lovely knowledge that's in his brain to his teammates when he has some buy-in with them.
So one of the things you mentioned there is you're working sort of as a positional coach. I know you've done that a lot in the past as well. I'm trying to think of how exactly to phrase this, but what exactly is your role as a strategic coach? I mean, I feel like it's very dependent on the team, but especially you guys, like ahead of, you have what, head manager, head coach, head of LOL, head, is it, did they actually move you to head of strategy yet? And if so, like what actually is your role?
Yeah, I'm basically just head at this point. I'm just the head. No, all seriousness. I think my role, like you said, it depends so much on what the team needs. Um, I'm happy to take responsibilities in any areas of coaching. I would say like last year when we had Archu and Seth as assistant coaches, I had a much bigger role of being a mentor for new coaches. Like I was helping them developing their skill sets as coaches, as both assistant coaches, but also positional coaches. And this year our staff is obviously like it's smaller. It's one, well, it's not just one person, it's multiple people smaller. Like, but in terms of coaches, we are one down. Um, so my role as a strategic coach this year has been a bit odd because we've also had the visa issues with Mac, which meant that like I've both been in charge and helping out with draft. I've been doing scouting part. I've been, learning from other teams. I've been doing my positional coaching. I've been doing communication coaching. There's been a lot of stuff. But in an ideal world, I get to share a lot of the workload with Mac, and we kind of like cover for each other. So we don't really have like Mm. There's not anything that he does that I don't do, and vice versa. But the aspects of those areas will usually be whichever we like the most, which is like Mac's philosophy on delegating workloads is making sure that one, like educating people in areas where they're not good at, because sometimes if you're not good at something and you learn that role, you will like that a lot. Like that happened for me with positional coaching. He pushed me really hard to go into positional coaching after spring 2021, and it's been my favorite part of coaching since then, which was just like a huge eye opener. Um, but what it means is that any coaching staff at Mac has will be super versatile because we can do all of the things like individually. But most importantly, we get to do what we love the most. And that's just huge.
I think it's such a big part as well, giving people ownership over an area, you know, so like you're in charge of this thing, like people really thrive kind of in that situation.
For sure. For sure. I think in 2021, my thing was scouting, and I considered myself a wonderful scout, and I still do to this day. But you're right. Having that flexibility and also developing as a coach and developing your skill set from being just specialized in scouting to now being specialized in scouting and drafting and positional coaching is crazy.
When you say scouting, do you mean the enemy teams that you're going to play against or for new players or?
Yeah, so scouting is honestly, well, it's broad. You're right. So for 2021, it was primarily finding weaknesses and presenting them in a way, finding weaknesses in enemy team and presenting them in a way before match days to our team that would allow us to punish those weaknesses within our ability of playing. Um, so some teams would have some very obvious weaknesses that I literally just wouldn't highlight to our team because it wasn't within our skill set to punish those areas. So that was something I enjoyed a lot. Still enjoy a lot. I think watching League of Legends is something like I'll do 12 hours a day. So watching with different purposes, like watching Asian teams with a purpose of, understanding the game better. Watching G2 or Mad Lions or another team with the purpose of how the fuck do I beat these guys? It makes your viewing experience different and less monotone.
Mm. Yeah, I think variety is always something that we tend to forget, both for players and for coaches, where if we're just spamming out scrims and just spamming out games, it can be it adds up quite fast.
Really does.
So, what's your, well, obviously only as much as you can share, but what's your process to scout an enemy team? So, let's say well, actually, that'd be even the first question. When do you start? If we do you look 2 weeks in advance? You look 3 weeks, or is it just who are we playing this week? Like, how does that actually work step by step?
So step by step, we can just start like at the beginning of the split because it looks increasingly different throughout the split. Like in the beginning, honestly, for week one, you have borderline nothing to scout. For this year, we have some scouting, right? Like going into spring, you have like some winter games, but starting at the very start of winter, you have nothing. Like you have solo queue accounts, and some players are lazy and they don't hide their accounts, so you'll get some info on a champion that didn't know existed. But the further you get into the split, but I guess more so the further you get into the year, the more you'll start seeing patterns repeat themselves, and it becomes like more exciting for me at least. Because you also get to sort of see like a team's development if they've changed a lot from winter to summer or from spring to summer, or if they haven't. And if they haven't, usually that's a pretty good sign that you have a good shot at beating them because like you have to develop in this game. So my process looks like in best of ones, it's usually the like scouting starts pretty late because like the schedule is so tightly packed. Like we have three scrim days, one off day, 3 game days, which means that for best of one, we do it whenever there is time, which there isn't really. Um, Luckily, it's only 3 weeks, and for week one, there's nothing you can do realistically. For week two, a lot of the time, patterns haven't actually like shown themselves to an extent where I feel comfortable making a game plan around them. But by the time of week three, you've had 6 games, and usually with 6 games data, there will be some patterns of some players that you can punish. So by week three, usually I start a bit earlier, just to make sure that I cover those 6 games. And then going into the best of series are the most fun for me because that's where in the past what we did was that we would present the scouting report the day before the match day. So sort of gives the player some time to like soak in the knowledge and have it like in the back of the mind and then do small reminders on game day. But I pushed really hard, I think, in 2022, no, 2023, to move the process in a way where I would instead of doing the off day together with the rest of the team, I would do my scouting day then, and then present it on day one of scrims, and then have my off day another day. Because that way we could sort of target practice with the scouting report in mind if there was something that was really important for us to work on during that week. And I think that when we've done that, like you immediately have like deliberate practice in your scrim, like on top of what other team goals you have, and I think that's been the most successful for me.
Yeah, I love that. Even just for the fact of the variety, like we just spoke about, but especially considering you can keep everyone, develop a specific strategy throughout the week to play against a specific opponent. I think it's great. So when you're looking at someone to scout, one of the questions that I get a lot from people who are just moving into it for the first time, it'd be great to get your opinion on when is it a pattern and when is it just a play that they did one time? So if they set up Dragon in a certain way in week one and it's like very telegraphed and it kind of looks like this is a set play, but they might never do it again. Like when does it a pattern and when is it just a play that they did this one time?
So normally I have like I work in actually I'll show you here. Maybe I'm not sure if you have a way to show it, but I'll show you how we do it if I can find it.
I don't, unfortunately.
Okay, all good. So normally I just work like in a Google Docs and I take like all of my notes and it looks like a mess. Once that mess is then done and I've watched like my 6 games plus, um very often we'll start splitting it into sections of, let me see if I can find it for you here.
I can put it on in post afterwards, but for now I can't actually see it myself, I think.
All good, all good. Okay, basically what we do is that we have like a Google Docs where all of my standard notes goes, and then once they become patterns, which I would say is when a team does something 4 times or more. So if they have the same approach to Drake, if they have the same approach to Grubs, if they react the same way on weak side, or don't react the same way on weak side when they're taking Grubs on bot side, for example, and sort of the way that my brain functions is that like initially I just passively observe everything. I'm not looking for anything in particular when I scout, which is very different from looking to get better at League of Legends Baron setup, for example, where you look for specific things. I try to just let my brain pick up on everything. Um, but but at least my experience so far has been that all teams in the world has very 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 strong patterns, especially around set piece plays, how they play out their level one, their early game pathing, and what that means when they have priors, when they don't have priors, and of it like the big ones are Nashers and Heralds and Grubs, because you have to have an opinion on these neutrals when you're a team. So I would say like 3+ can do, but usually 4+ of similar approaches to situations is what I'm looking for. Hey, heal, that's my water. Cat, go away. Sorry.
That's all right. It's all right. And then to you mentioned you put together a report and doing it earlier now than you used to. What kind of things go in the report? Because that's also one of the questions. I mean, you said already it's only stuff that we can actually capitalize on. So is that a crucial thing where everything that you're reporting on isn't just the first step of they do this, but also the second step of we're going to do this because of that? Like what goes in the report? And I think one of the things that I see quite often, especially when people are new to this, is just so much goes in, like just everything goes in, any single pattern that you could recognize. So how do you put together a report?
So the way that I would put together a report is by one, highlighting their most common patterns rather than every single pattern there is, because there will be something like when I do a scouting report, there will be something that I can barely scrape 3 examples of together, which then, in my opinion, very often isn't a super strong pattern, and it isn't something that we should actually actively play around. And then you will have patterns that there are 8, 9, 10 examples of, because this is just how this team plays League of Legends. This is how they fundamentally view League of Legends, and those are the important ones, right? Because realistically, there's a few elements to creating a scouting report, right? It has to be short and crisp. It has to look clean, because you are working with esports players who plays computer games all day long, and their attention span, like usually I will like I'm good at presentation, and I'm fine at speaking. I will hold their attention for 20 minutes, right? If I go like 40 minutes, 50 minutes, I've lost 1 or 2 or 3 players, like they're gone. Which means that I need to be hyper focused in my choices of what I choose to present to them that are valuable in a scouting report. So those things will typically be things that one we can either punish like through stuff that we are already doing as a team and the way that we play League of Legends, or two, things that we have like previously or continuously getting punished by, that is very good to be aware of. So making them hyper aware of sequences that we are currently already struggling with, and if we play into this play pattern, we are gonna get fucked. So that's usually how I would structure it. I would try to keep it to a minimum of like 4, maximum 5 big scouting patterns, because like as soon as you start having first Drake, third Drake, Herald, Grubs, top dive, weak side, jungle camps, like if you have 7, 8, 9 topics, there's no chance your players are gonna remember it anyway. So important part is really just making sure that like I know my scouting report has been successful when we go on game day. And the way that we structure game day is that we do like a pre warm up where we just go and we move our body a bit, and during that sort of like physical warm up, I will just ask them, okay, what are the important things about this team? And whenever they can tell me my 4 or 5 points, or earlier in the split, it was Mac because he couldn't join the studio. Whenever they could tell us those 4 or 5 points in that moment, it'd be a good scouting report. Um, in the past, what we did was that we did like reminders for scouting report, like when we did the huddle. But we've now changed that away from doing the scouting reminders, like when we do the warm up, and then in the huddle we just remind them of what our players are good at, and then they go in and they do those things.
Great. Yeah, I love the consistency and also the getting them, involved as well, like keeping the reminders and keeping the questioning. I think is a perfect way to approach it. In terms of the report, I mean, especially now when you're doing it a little bit earlier, do you do a different one for coaches? Is it the same one, or do you sit down after your off day and if it's Mac who's deciding the sort of structure of the week, do you go through it in more detail with him or the same? Or
So honestly, Mac and I just have a lot of buy-in with each other, and we trust each other really well. So if I come and tell him like, here's the TLDR of my scouting report, I think we should focus on X, Y, Z, then he will just trust me, and we'll go by that. Because one thing that we do find is, finding times for meetings throughout the week very often ends up being like really inefficient, because meetings are just long. Like, meeting just takes time, and there's multiple opinions, and people need to have time to speak, and especially bigger staff meetings where you have to have your analyst from France and your performance manager here. So as much as humanly possible, we try to minimize how often we sit together. We do like a weekly like staff meeting, and that's like our big time consuming meeting. But for scouting reports, honestly, unless there's a few specific like clips or something I want to show from the scouting report, I'll just let him know what the TLDR is, and also how I think that TLDR impacts drafts. So like, if we need to have a bigger priority on prepping for hard prio lanes, or how we want to approach counter picks on red side, stuff like this.
great. I want to jump to what some of the other stuff you said before at the beginning. I mean, one of them, of course, is very close to my heart when you're talking about developing other coaches and working with coaches. So, well, just in general, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Was that something you've always wanted to do? Did it happen because you just started to get more experience? And of course, you guys were bringing on quite a lot of coaches over the few years.
So it's something I've always wanted to do since like I really committed to League of Legends. I think like I started out as a player in playing Go for LOL and getting my ass kicked by Yankers every weekend. And I learned pretty quickly that like that what I really loved about playing League was teaching League. Because I was a fine player, but I was never great. I had some ladder anxiety as well that didn't help. But I really fucking love teaching League of Legends to well, just about anyone who wanted to listen. Um, so I think one of the big things that I was really happy with when I worked with Mad Lions for my 3 years there were that they allowed me to work outside of the team. So like, my free time was my own time. So I spent a lot of time working with Furia in Brazil. I worked with some LLA teams. I worked with a bunch of like individual players and individual coaches. Um, and specifically coaching coaches, I think, is something that's really close to my heart, because um, I think LEC has sort of run into this stagnation of replacing the old guard and finding the new guard to take over in LEC. I guess I'm slowly becoming part of the old guard, but it's like we've had the same names forever, and there's there's so little info about what coaches does on the scene. Like, I've been here for 3 years, and I have no clue how Dylan Falco is as a coach. I have no clue how Young Buck is as a coach. I have no clue how Yamato is as a coach. And these guys have been around forever, and no one, like we just don't have access to how coaches coach. Um, so what what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to help like sort of like the outcast areas like Brazil and LLA. But especially when it comes to EU coaches, I want to help, whoever is the most hungry and wants it the most and are good. I want to help them, gain access to the information that I didn't have when I was in ERL, and that I only got because Mac was willing to work with me, right? So I'm just paying back because I came from UK scene with nothing, and I think anyone who's hungry enough and good enough can get up here, and I think it's good to change out the old players and the old coaches every year.
Amazing. I mean, obviously, that's like exactly what I'm trying to do this year, and trying to have these kind of conversations so that people can start to see, and we don't need to be so guarded with everything, and we don't need to be so like, or if I mention how I do something, suddenly I'm going to be less valuable, or suddenly everyone's going to be able to do it, because we all come in with such different experiences. And one of the things that I've found this year and last year, when I started to focus purely on working with coaches, is that the impact that you can have as a coach working with coaches is often even greater than you have with players, because so many of the people I talk to, they haven't ever had support in that way. And so even just thinking, even having a dedicated time where we just think about how you're coaching, what you want to get better at, what you struggle with, already, even without my input at all, is already like really, really beneficial. So is that something that was kind of officially ever part of your role, or just something you were interested in? Because when I was doing research for this conversation, I didn't realize that was something that you were doing until other people were telling me about it.
No, that was never something that was official. That was something that I didn't demand, but I requested if it was possible for me to do this because, I mean, it's just important for me to give back, and I think that like, um, if if I don't do this and other coaches don't do this, then LEC is just gonna be like this little incest community of like just fucking jumping LEC teams, and we don't get like enough new people in fast enough. And to be fair, like I like when Mac and I did our like interviews for coaches this off season. Oh no, last off season. Sorry, not this one. We didn't have time for that one. Um, we actually thought that like the level of in-game knowledge the coaches had in the ERL scene was a lot higher than it was when he interviewed me. So there's been like a nice development in terms of in-game knowledge, but we still have like very similar issues with a lot of the ERL coaches coming from, well, no teaching backgrounds, no studying backgrounds, and a lot of them just being former players and not having like the skill set outside of the in-game knowledge. So wherever I can help there is really important, because I think you touched on something really like really true, that people feel like they cannot share how they coach because they're scared of losing their job, which is just like that's just wild to me, because like that's never happened in football. It's never happened in handball. Like Jurgen Klopp has never gone out and given an interview and immediately lost his job at Dortmund or become a worse coach from it. And like my entire skill set is not what I know, it's how I do it, like it's not just what I know. And I think that's a really important thing to factor in when you decide to hold back information on how you coach or how you develop yourself or your players, because sharing these things will make EU better as a region in the long term. And not sharing these things means that I don't know anything about any of my fellow coaches in the LEC. Um, and they're not pushing me forward. The only ones who are pushing me forward is Mac and my own players. And I would like, well, I think G2 are pushing me forward as well, right? I think their work ethic, the way that they approach League of Legends is pushing me forward. But I would like for more teams to actively push each other to get better, and to share things with each other.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, exactly what you said. It's not what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. I was speaking to someone just last week who was a performance director at a bunch of different Olympic programs. And he was talking about there's a guy from Germany who's won a medal, might even won a gold at something like every Olympics since 74 or something like that. And he just
Wow.
makes his complete training programs public all the time, because it's like it's not what's written down that's important, it's what I'm actually doing. And yeah, in esports we are incredibly defensive. So of course, if someone has access to someone like yourself, they're going to be able to have a kind of path to develop themselves as a coach. But if that you only have a limited amount of time in the day, I only had a limited amount of time in the day. If you're giving advice to a coach who wants to develop themselves as well, are there some key places that you'd start? What are the things that you would get people to consider, or things to look at?
Um, I would look at a bunch of things that were outside of game related first, because I think one of the big things we run into so often as coaches, is whether or not you have the ability to transfer your knowledge to other people. And you need to be hyper aware, or learn how to be hyper aware of whether or not you are capable of doing that currently. Because if you aren't, then you cannot be a good coach. And a few things I would look at in order to get better at this. We have like this one book that is a must-read book for our coaches, and also like we do summaries and master classes on it for our players. It's called Never Split the Difference with Chris Voss, um, which is just he's basically just faker of communication. Um, and and understanding, like I think he labels it as tactical empathy, but just like understanding how active listening works is I would say like a mandatory skill to have as a coach. Because if you don't know how to listen actively, like really fucking listen, like don't prep your next answer, don't think about what you're gonna tell him in response to what he's saying now, but learn how to listen to your players, to your manager, to your upper management. If you don't have that skill set currently, you need to acquire it ASAP. Um, I think that's really important. And then when that is done, I think the other thing that's really important is like one of the big reasons why coaches doesn't want to share information is because there's sort of like this idea that everyone has the secret recipe to good League of Legends, which is just not true. Like I've won 3 championships and not at one point have I sat down and thought, yeah, I know League of Legends better than anyone in the EU. Because like if you're not hungry, if you're not humble, if you're not willing to go in with a mindset of I may be wrong, you'll be wrong very often, but you won't admit it and you won't learn from your mistakes. And you'll end up getting stagnated in the way that you coach, in the way that you view League of Legends. And once you stagnate, that's when you're fucked because this game is ever moving. So I definitely say that there's a couple of books I could recommend that like are basically just mandatory for Mad Lions. No, Vitality. um, yeah.
Yeah, go for it. Recommend away.
Never Split the Difference is a book on communication, like all sorts of communication, um, and listening. Anything from body language to tone of voice to how you transfer knowledge through communication, how you get through to people. And this book is just like it's been one of the most impactful books for me as a human being, not just as a coach, but particularly as a husband, actually, like much more as a husband, because I was already good at active listening and I was already good at a bunch of the stuff from the book in my role as a coach, but I was much less good as a husband. And being a better communicator in my relationship with my wife has certainly made my life a lot easier, and has made me be able to spend more time on League of Legends in a healthy way. Um, then we have a book called Atomic Habits, which is just about how habit forming works. And I think understanding how habit forming works really helps with this whole, like anyone who isn't familiar with creating habits yet will very often seek instant gratification, and understanding how and when instant gratification isn't the insta win button and isn't the best for you in as a player, because you start the year in January and you have to peak in August, and October as a League of Legends player, like in LEC. You have to peak at summer, like at finals playoffs, and you have to peak at Worlds, right? Those are the two times at Worlds, no, at the year where you have to peak. And understanding how to create routines and habits in your life, both inside League of Legends and in your sleep and in your gym routine and in your relationship with your partner is alpha omega. Because if you don't peak when the timing is right, you won't go to Worlds. Um, so that one is really OP. Then we have a book called Range, which is honestly just about like the upsides to specializing in multiple different things rather than just specializing in Tetris and only Tetris. And also how your brain works when, like, which part of your brain gets activated depending on sort of what activities you do, and making sure that you have different activities that stimulates different parts of your brain in order to make full use of that lovely chunk of flesh inside of your skull. Um, Is there a third one? Oh yeah, fourth one. And this is like sort of our newest edition. And this one, okay, there's two. Holy shit, we have so many books. How Champions Think, written by a sports psychologist. I can't remember his name now. Mac would insta know it. But this book is just really strong, and we use this book a lot to sort of help our players, to help our players develop higher standards. This book, in relation to David Goggins' book, Can't Hurt Me, which is also just a book on how, like, this book should be taken with a big grain of salt, because David Goggins is a fucking psycho. He's a crazy human being. He's not normal. Um, but this book is really good when you want to raise your understanding of the standards that you have. Very often what ends up happening when we present this book to players, or when I read it myself the first time, and the same for Mac, was that we went in and I was like, yeah, my standards for working is really good. Like I have like this and this and this schedule and I do this well. And when I was done with the book, I was like, okay, I can push myself like a lot more without risking putting myself in danger of burnout. So helping me find a way to optimize my standards without putting myself at risk. Obviously, this book is open to interpretation, so I interpreted it this way. I didn't go and do any ultra marathons or anything like that. And then our newest edition, because we've had a big shift in how we approach roster building this year. So TLDR was that if Mac and I wouldn't have been kicked from Mad Lions, we would have built a roster with a 3-year goal in mind to be good internationally. Because we have now won LEC 3 times. We have gone to Worlds. Well, I've gone to Worlds 3 times as well. And what I've sort of figured out is that going to Worlds, if you're not there as an actual contender, is not very fun. And there's a bunch of reasons as to why we haven't been there in the past, but some of them has like one of the things has just been that we've gone there not believing we could win. Um, and that we want to change. And that's part of how champions think, that we try to introduce this book into our culture. But most recently, Mac and I read a book called The Captain's Class, which is just a book that basically put together a list of the most successful teams across all time. And he has like his own metrics as to why he deems them the most successful teams. And then within those teams, he tries to take all of the captains from the teams and sort of see what similarities they have. And the TLDR of that book is basically that very often on the most successful teams across like the entirety of sports history, the biggest, most successful captains were not the loudest, most well-known, most outspoken people. They were very often people who were introverted and especially particularly specialized in their area of sport. And for the most part, they were what he refers to as water carriers. Um, they were the guys who made the team work. They were not the superstar. They were the guys who did all of the extra work in order to make sure that shit went through. So captains like Henderson from Liverpool, a player who was vice captain but never main captain at Liverpool as well, Milner. These sort of personalities that just they do more, like they work harder. And this actually really sparked a big shift in how we view roster building, to the point where now the way that we are thinking about roster building is that you need a captain and you need a vice captain that can take over for your captain when he's either too old or burned out or doesn't want to play league anymore. And then you need your three Neymars, Ronaldos, Messi. You need your three hands. So that's been a big part of like our off season. This off season was making sure that honestly either we got Hilisang or Linsas. And when we couldn't get either one at K Corp, we kind of like, it wasn't the only reason, but it was one of the big reasons as to why we didn't consider like signing with them in the end.
Yeah, there's so much to go through there. There's so many things that I'd love to talk about. We'll get onto roster building, I think, in a little bit, because I'll stick for now on the topic of sort of developing yourself as a coach. I haven't read the last two, but definitely adding them to my ever growing reading list. But also for people who maybe don't read that much or haven't built up the habit or the skill of reading, which I think is an important distinction. There's also a fantastic masterclass by both Chris Voss and James Clear. I mean, Chris Voss has done a few, but James Clear as well, if you prefer to like watch these kind of things. There's one of the things, actually, I think the way that I like it the best was actually from a podcast rather than from the masterclass, but looking into a way to practice active listening with my clients of doing this labeling practice, and something that I've used a lot, where you find like neutral people as well, I think is always a good tip, but just actually having a go at really putting your focus and your attention on the person that you're talking to, or even just observing. I mean, I think he used the example of in a store, just if you're at the checkout and you think you detect something with the other person, you just say, "What, you're having a bad day," or something like that. And you quickly realize that the worst way that ends up with is just them saying, "No, actually it's great," and then it still ends up being like a good interaction. So I think there's so many useful things there.
Yeah.
One of the things, I don't know if it was because of when I read it, or might have been actually because of a conversation with Mac when he recommended the same book, but what is so range is a lot about, as you mentioned, multiple different areas, being a generalist or a polymath or however you want to talk about it. What do you think about that compared to the Outliers thing, which was another book that I don't know if the comparison was only really there for me, or I can't remember if he even references Outliers in the range book. But what do you think about that? This like hyper specialization versus broader specialization, both for coaches and for players, and just for people in general.
So I think it depends on sort of what stage your team is in. One thing that we have sort of been the most successful with, and the schedule sometimes requires you to do in LEC because best of ones are so impactful in the new format, is that very often you sort of have to approach like the first 3 weeks in winter, spring, and summer a bit more hyper specialized than you would like to. Like I personally do not like to just buckle down and only play one play style and become the best at it, even though that's how we have won championships in the past. Because very often what ends up happening if you do that long term is that you're hyper specialized and then you meet a team that isn't, and you go into a best of five and now it's hard. Um, so I think hyper specialization is incredibly good for learning fundamentals together as a team. I think it's so good for understanding how one certain playstyle functions, and then using that as like sort of your fundament as building blocks to then you know reach out afterwards. So I think early in the year it's a very good thing to do. I think there will be periods of time as a player as well, where it's really important to be able to hyper specialize. Especially like a good example for me is when I work as a positional coach, and I want my player to pick up a new champ. So like we can use Vito as an example. Vito for next split, one of his goals. Can I say that? Okay. I mean,
A new
so
champ.
Niski in summer 2022. Um, we had him hyper specialize in picking up Talia and Asia, um, because his champion pool was too narrow, which meant that he got targeted in best offs, and it was really hard for us to play around drafts when he got this hard targeted. So we would have periods of time where I would literally just tell him to like, listen, your Gragas is already 10 out of 10, your X is already 10 out of 10. I need you to go and play 15 games of Talia, 15 games on Asia, play nothing else, watch nothing else, just go and pick those two champions up. And then we'll talk about like, because different people learn different ways. So with Niski, reputation is key. Like he has to have reputation. And I need to help him find the conditions for both how the champions functions in the trade patterns in lane, how they function in their openings in team fights, what they need in team fights. With Vincent, it's quite different. Vincent is very quick at picking up concepts. So for him, I can just introduce him to the concept of holding your W on Talia and why it's important, and he will just like pick it up like that. He doesn't need repetition. But for both of them, hyper specializing and playing those champions is really key when you want to pick up a new champ. And because what that will allow you to is at the end of the year is that you have range. You can play multiple different styles at a really high level. So definitely I think it depends on what stage you're at as a team, but also whether or not you need to broaden your champion pool.
And you still, even though it's range within League of Legends. It's not, because I mean, a lot of the examples I think he had in the range book was like
Yeah.
best sports Federer who played loads of sports growing up and that kind of thing. Like, do you encourage any of that? Is there any Valorant games that you guys play or stuff like that?
Yeah. So range outside of League of Legends is also really important, and we try to really emphasize the importance of doing exactly this. Like learn new things. I don't care what it is, as long as it's not within League of Legends. Right now, VTO is playing Valorant. It's good that you just said that. That's funny. So he's learning Valorant, and he has a goal of being Ascendant. I think the third highest rank, so similar to Masters, maybe D1 in Valorant. That's like a yearly goal for him. Um, and Douglas wants to get good at paddle, so he's getting good at paddle. Mac wants to beat Vincent in table tennis, so he's getting good at table tennis. In prior years, we've also had players that was really interested in getting better at chess. So yeah, we try to use range also outside of League of Legends, because like one of the things that most people will recognize when they've worked in esports and when they've worked in League of Legends is that if you spend too much time in this game, at some point, well, it's the same for honestly anything I've done in life. If you spend too much time doing the same thing, regardless of how much variety you have within your field here, you're gonna at some point put on some tunnel vision. So getting that range, honestly, for the like for the biggest part for me is just making sure that you get some actual range from the game and you can see it in a broader perspective. And I think that's really been the big reason for me as to why I've really pushed hard for my players to do this, both in a team setting, but especially as my like as a positional coach. I feel like it's my responsibility to make sure that Vincent is the best athlete he can be, and I think he's the best athlete when he plays less League of Legends.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic and fantastic advice for coaches as well. I think one of the things that is often underappreciated about having this range is that the more new things you learn, the more you will get better at learning new things, which then applies back to what your primary, goal is anyway, which would be, obviously knowing more about the game. And you start to see patterns and bring in things from places that you wouldn't expect. I mean, chess is an absolute classic example. I don't know how much of my coaching became stuff that I've learned in chess that I've brought into league, but I think a big part of it. So again, going back to the advice for coaches that we can give who want to develop themselves, one thing I always say is start with just what you're already interested in. Like you don't need to pick Valorant because it's another Riot game. It's just if you like it, then go for it and like explore the things you're interested in exploring, books, podcasts, all that kind of thing, and you'll be amazed at not only the connections you'll draw, but how it will encourage you to be excited about learning new things, and then it just kind of all snowballs.
Yeah, I'll give a couple of like real life examples as well for how we implement range in League of Legends. So most people who know me or follow me know that I'm a massive Liverpool fan, and a massive football fan to the point where like I will very often make analogies from football to League of Legends when I coach this. I had Vincent over for a Liverpool game. He's the cutest. He's my loveliest favorite boy, and he wrote that he would be very happy if I would invite him for a Liverpool game. So I did. And we sat and watched Liverpool play, and we talked about League of Legends in relation to Liverpool for 90 minutes. And how like the Gegenpress and Liverpool like their approach to how you play football when you lose the ball can translate into tempo usage in League of Legends, which is a crazy thing. And you can do this, like you said, with anything. If you're specialized in chess, if you're specialized in football, we have a couple of set piece plays in our team that are based on basket concepts like screening. Um, if you can do this, it's also a very entertaining way for you to transfer knowledge to your players. And it's something that has been like massively successful for us. Because it also allows me to make presentation where I can slap Mohamed Salah's face on, and it's wonderful for me. I'm happy, they're happy, anyone's happy who looks at Salah.
It's perfect. Yeah, I think it's such good advice. And again, touching it again, 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 but more variety, like more ways to learn the same thing is always the same. I'm actually just started reading a book called Seven's Heaven, about the coach of the Fiji Seven side. And
Okay.
I was actually planning to do a tweet about it today, which is why it's on my mind. There's a bit right near the beginning where he was trying to sort of test the players, and he'd never lived in Fiji, very successful coach, but spent his whole life in England. And Fiji are very famous for this incredibly flamboyant, they're everyone's second favorite team. You know, it's like your country, and then if England don't win, I want Fiji to win, and it's the same like the whole world over. And
Nice.
they're incredibly fast. And he was testing them when he first arrived to start to build the kind of roster. He was testing their speed, so he was doing like the 40-meter dash, and they were not at all impressive numbers, at all.
Okay.
And he was thinking like, what are they? You know, they're famous for not doing well. Not famous. They had a reputation for having really poor structure. So they all just suddenly got unfit over the off season or something like that. Until eventually one of the coaches, who was Fijian, came to him and said, "Don't just have them run. Like have one chase the other." So they started a few meters back, and suddenly the times are like way faster. And then he's like, "And give the guy in front the ball," and suddenly it's faster again. But the thing that he said, which really resonated with what you just said, is that it wasn't the players that were failing, it was the way that he was teaching the thing that was the failure. And so bringing in these concepts, okay, maybe this is something we've learned before that no one got, but now I'm going to tie it to football, or now I'm going to tie it to basketball, now I'm going to tie it to something else, just allows you for more ways to like latch that idea into your players.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I also think you touched on something really important that I think all coaches needs to keep in mind as well. Is right, like is the I may be wrong approach, which is another book that is a great book about a Swedish guy who was a very successful business person, and then he became a monk. Um, and the book is called I May Be Wrong, and it's honestly a mindset that I carry with me every day because when scrims are going wrong or officials are going wrong, I guarantee you that the first thing that comes into my mind is never my player did X, Y, Z. It's how could I have done this differently? And I think approaching coaching with that mindset is going to remove a lot of stress, a lot of tension from you and your players, because it's something I see a lot when I watch other teams interact with each other, when I see players interact with each other, when I see coaches interact with players, is that I think there's a pretty big tendency for our knee-jerk reaction to be looking for faults in others, when very often looking for faults in yourself first. Obviously, it's not that your players are perfect, but finding that 1% that you can increase before pointing fingers, I think has helped me massively getting buy-in with my players and having an ability to change their mind. Because if the first thing I do when they fuck up is assume that they have just fucked up, then very often we're gonna go into a fight, and it's gonna be an unproductive conversation.
I think that's such a fantastic piece of advice, because also the thing that you said at the end, it actually helps you get the buy-in, and it actually helps you have the impact. Because what I see quite a lot is that, especially like what you said before, people are getting better and better game knowledge, but maybe not getting better at the other areas of coaching. And so they put more and more of their stock, or their, if we use a Jocko Willink phrase, like their leadership capital, in the fact that
Yeah.
they know lots about the game. Therefore, the way they think that they should be listened to is, I just have to be really confident about the game. And if I'm not confident, they won't listen to me about it. And you know, confidence and assuming you're right all the time is not the same thing. And yet people
Nope.
quite often fall down that trap. And to be fair as well, like I have a lot of sympathy for coaches who end up doing that, because a lot of times, especially in the ERLs or even in the LEC, the timeframes are so short, and we see a lot
Yeah.
of decisions that are heavily impacted, shall we say, at least by the players. And if the player thinks you're better because from week one, I know this guy's better because he's super confident about the game, compared to someone who's like, oh, I might be wrong, like that kind of thing. You can
Yeah.
sort of, you see how it just gets worse and worse. We just keep falling down that same pitfall.
Definitely. I think that's a big issue for UL, right? Is that establishing a culture where being wrong is a good thing, failing is a good thing. Like all of these things are great fucking things. It's something that, like in my personal life, my wife struggled with a lot. Like failure is just something that's wrong, which is something that we're working on at home, and something certainly a culture that Mac and I have always fostered. Because like if you don't make mistakes, you can improve. Like all that matters is how you respond to failure. Like
Mm.
you failing 100 times, I don't care. Like if you fail in the same thing after getting feedback 7 times in a row, okay, maybe I care.
Mm.
But creating an environment where it's okay for you to say my bad and not risk any backlash or massive backlash from being wrong or making a mistake, is just gonna like speed up development so much.
Yeah,
and it doesn't matter if it's coaches or players.
yeah, I think it's completely crucial. It's that there's one of the I like quotes to talk about my sort of coaching philosophy, and my probably my absolute core one is there is no effort without error or shortcoming. And it's like
Yeah,
before you talk about okay, we can win or we learn, or any of the things that come from like how we would learn from mistakes, which is important. But before any of that, you just have to accept that we can't do anything without the possibility of being wrong. And especially when we're talking about high performance and a lot of it will become more and more exploratory, you have to be comfortable with being wrong. And yet, actually, if I think back over my career, I don't know if I've ever been in an environment where we were truly comfortable with mistakes and comfortable with the fact that they're going to happen.
yeah, yeah. I think that's something that this year we've been very successful in, and something that is one of our like core pillars of our culture, and something that's been hard to establish in past teams, but certainly something we're gonna keep doing. Because especially when you are developing rookies, having well, first of all, having them understand that it's okay for them to make mistakes, but secondly, having your veterans understand that your rookies are gonna come in and they're gonna make a lot of mistakes, and depending on how you react or what your response is to those mistakes, he's gonna get good faster, or he's gonna get good slower. Those are the two options you have. Oh, he's not gonna get good. Those are like the three choices. And a lot of it comes down to helping our players understand, especially the veterancy, on how they are supposed to take care of their player who's failing or making mistakes, right? Because if you're perma bashing your new rookie for making XYZ mistakes, he's gonna start losing his confidence, and the second that he loses his confidence, you're fucked.
Mm. Mm. So, how did you go about creating this kind of culture? I mean, you mentioned there working actually with the veterans on how they're communicating and how they're helping and how they're maybe nurturing new talent. But how else, what are the other ways that you've found to actually create this culture? Because, speaking from experience, just saying it a lot doesn't necessarily help.
So I think a lot of it comes from making sure, like this year, one of the biggest differences we had was that our boot camp was like a get to know each other boot camp. It was a get to like each other boot camp. So we actually didn't play any League of Legends in our off-season bootcamp in December when we went to Paris. We literally just spent time together. Like we talked about League, we did a bunch of team activities. We established like sort of like our social figures in the group who were like the glue of the social groups, which is Kasi. He's just the glue. And we established who was our in-game captain, which is Hilly, because his knowledge of the game is just unbelievable. He's a guy that he's the guy who came to the team last year and he couldn't communicate. He couldn't transfer any of his knowledge. So all of our work being put into Hilly is honestly helping him transfer that knowledge. So the way that we've gone about that is one, making sure that our players have they have a joint bank account, Mac calls it. And you have to deposit into that bank account when you want to withdraw. Because if you're only withdrawing, depositing is having a good time together, creating good memories together, and then withdrawing is when we fight. So making sure that that bank account is in a good spot where we can have fights without them being super impactful, or without them leaving deep scars or long discussions or grudges, is something that we try to build up very early in the season, because we recognize that as the split goes on, people are going to get more stressed, and when you get more stressed, very often your ability to react well or respond well to critique, or if something goes wrong, is going to get worse. And so we are never going to say you can never respond poorly, but we try to build up that bank account to the point where when it does happen, that is not team breaking. um, and then we make a big point of being really harsh on high standards in the way that we communicate and interact with each other. Because the thing is, if players are allowed to make discussions personal or attack each other, the second that one person is allowed to do this, you've just given a green card to the four other players that at some point you can do this too. So one thing that we've done and we've been super hard on is that whenever this has happened, we have literally postponed that game's review, and we've pulled that person aside and had a talk with him before anything else. Because that's how you make sure that people respond well. Because once you allow certain behaviors to exist within a team, you can't stop it. It's too late. We've experienced this over the last 2 years, especially. So we've made it a big point for us that we have agreed on standards in communication and how we interact with each other beforehand, and then we just hold everyone to that standard throughout the year.
Mm. And I think it's a very good thing to point out that you have to be so rigorous around holding that standard. I mean, I think it was Phil Neville who was saying the main job as a coach is once you get a group of standards that everyone agrees to, like my main job as a coach is to just keep pointing to that standard, keep pointing to that thing we agreed to, because people, whether consciously or not, they have a tendency to push it a little bit. You go like a millimeter over the line, and if nothing happens, then you go like another millimeter further. And quite often, I mean, it happens with clients I work with a lot, where at the beginning we go over a bunch of things about how would you actually set up a culture and how would you do it consciously rather than just sort of letting whatever happens. And it might start off great, and we might start off in that honeymoon period where everyone's excited that we're doing this, we're coming in with the right attitude, and then you look near the end of the split and suddenly we're miles away from where we were. But there was never a big moment. It's just the small little things. So I think it's really good for you to say, like, it can be that it's worth just, right, we're not going to do this review because we need to deal with this thing straight away. The second it happens, it's just unacceptable.
Yeah, yeah, and it's something we certainly haven't done in the past, and sometimes it's also finding a balance, right? Like, I think touching on this is really important, understanding the group of players that you have, right? Because you're gonna be able to have players where if they are out of line, you can call them out in front of the whole team. But you will certainly also have players who are not capable of receiving harsh feedback in front of other people. And that's a big part of your task as a coach or manager or whatever you are in the team, is understanding how to give feedback to your team. Um, and those players as individuals. Because if you mismanage that, then things can go really wrong.
Mm.
As an example, I think that like when we were in Mad Lions 2021, whenever we had feedback for Humanoid or Armut, we could literally soft flame them in front of the team. We could just say like, "What the fuck are you doing here?" And they would just say, "Oh yeah, my bad, I was trolling." If you try to do the same with Kaiser, you would have a 2 hour long discussion. So understanding your players on how well and when and where they take feedback is really crucial. Because sometimes, like I said, you can uphold those standards in a way where we have to drop a review and pull one player to the side, and that's just the consequences of what happened. And other times, if you have a players, the same thing can happen in 5 minutes, and you just call them out in front of the whole team. But understanding how to do that is really crucial.
So how do you go about understanding that, at least in the most efficient way possible? And earlier you talked about the example with Niski was that he just needs to play loads of games. Like, how do you actually learn how people learn, and how do you learn how people respond to feedback? Because most people might not even know themselves. I mean, everyone wants direct and honest feedback. That's always the thing that people say. And yet, in practice, I think almost no one really does.
Yeah. So you have to do trial and error. You have to run into a wall or two. But you need to be aware when the fuck you hit that wall. Because if you hit that wall and you don't recognize that you're hitting a wall and you hit it again, then you have failed. Like that's on you, right? You cannot know from the get go. Like one thing that's really important is we talked a lot about like active listening and sort of communication skills. Another thing that's really good for coaches to educate themselves on and understand better is different learning styles. People learn in different manners. Some people, when you are coaching them, will learn from me doing a review on Chovy and showing his POV. Other people will learn a lot better from watching their own POV and what they are doing wrong, and then having their failures corrected, rather than watching someone do it good. But this is where you need to learn, right? So if you are coaching a player and you're coaching him in a way where you are constantly highlighting the mistakes that he's making, and he seems to keep making them, well, then it's on you to understand that perhaps this guy just needs to watch how Peanut does it when he is early cheese ganking, or when he's flashing over a wall, or he's doing XYZ. Um, and those different learning styles are very easy to educate. Well, not very easy, but they're sort of easy to educate yourself on once you've gone in and experimented with it a couple of times. and they are very closely linked to feedback styles, right? Like you go in and you give feedback to a guy in a general review on Discord with all 7 people there, and he's completely quiet or he starts shouting at you. Well, you have your first hint that this is not the best approach with this guy. And then you have the opposite experience with Linsas from K-Corp Academy, and you shout at him and you say, "What the fuck are you doing?" And he says, "My bad, bro." um, so just being hyper aware of the interactions with your players and how they are responding, and really paying attention to how they respond is how you pick up on it, because there's no way for you to know ahead of time, but you need to make sure that once you run into that wall, you only run into it once, because if you do it multiple times, that's what that can break teams.
Mm. Yeah, and really ties back into that active listening or labeling stuff that we were talking about, like you mentioned, you know. So it's not just how they respond in terms of what they tell you, but how they respond in terms of how does the mistake change, but also if you can tell, you know, often. I think also it's one of these things, it's the same when a lot of people, well, for most people, I think, when they start looking into this kind of like active listening style, is that as humans, we can actually intuit this kind of thing fairly well. You can get better at it, of course, but you just have to be actually conscious of it and think back after the interaction and think, did that go down well or did that go down badly? Not, he told me, yeah, okay, I get it. But actually, how did he look? How did it land? You know, when you said something, because your instant reaction, you can't ever escape that. You can't ever hide that. You will have an instant reaction to getting feedback. It doesn't matter how much you like direct feedback. You will. It still hurts. It's just nothing we can escape.
No, and it's really important to also help your players understand that, because this is something we've had in the past as well, is that your knee-jerk reaction isn't who you are. Like if your knee-jerk reaction is anger, you don't have to be an angry person. You might be an angry person, but we can, well, especially as coaches, it's our job to make sure that you cannot always happen, like you cannot always choose what a player says to you, but you can certainly develop your skill in how you respond to it. Um, and while you cannot completely mask whatever it is, you can take a deep breath. You can take 2 seconds to reconsider if you are, firing back instantly, or you take a step back and you try to de-escalate the situation. Because very often, what ends up happening when people have poor communication skills is that, like, we are perma-escalating situations that aren't even that big.
It's fantastic advice. One of the areas that I wanted to kind of move us to that you mentioned before, which I get it also ties back into the sport thing. I think it's an area that in esports we are really, really bad at still. And one of the areas that I think we miss in terms of how we're actually planning our training programs. You mentioned when you should peak before. You know, if you're a team that's going to Worlds, you need to be peaking for those dates. And the other thing that I think people don't appreciate enough yet in esports is that if you're a team that is, you know, struggling, you shouldn't be trying to peak at Worlds time because you'll be ready to go, but you won't be there. So you need to be kind of like reasonable with it. So how do you structure or I guess between you and Mac, how do you kind of structure your training program to make sure you're peaking at the right time? Because especially with this new format, it's no good to peak 4 weeks into the split only if you lose every game in the first three. So how do you balance that?
So I think we touched on it a little bit. I think for the first week you have to hyper specialize. You have to come in week one and just be good at something. Like you have to come in and you're just the best fucking team at Pub this year. You're just the best team at XYZ. And then once you've guaranteed your like 2-1 or 3-0 week, then you have bought yourself sufficient time to work mid or long term rather than short term. But for example, what happened for us, which is like incredible, and I've never had this before as a team, we went 0-3 in week one, and we were able to continuously work mid and long term. We were not in full firefighting mode when we went into practice for week two, because of the process oriented like training system that Mac and I encourage, right? We basically came into this. We came into week one. We knew we had like some weak points, and those weak points got really exposed. So we were already working on it beforehand, which allowed us to just continuously working on it through week two. And then obviously we went 3-0 in week two, which then bought us a lot of time moving into the next ones to keep focusing on mid and long term development. But you're definitely right. Like I actually think our prep for week one was potentially not hyper focused enough. Because we came in and we were not 100% confident in anything, and I think that was a mistake. Um, so that's usually how, with this format, I would recommend for any teams to approach it is go into week one and know that you have two comps that you can go in and you can play and you have 5 players on comfort champions. And if you do that, that's a successful week one. Then you can still go 0-3, and that really fucking sucks. Um, but making sure that you've done that without necessarily sacrificing, the team development, right? You want to hyper specialize in two comps that make sense for long term planning as well. And I think honestly for us, what has been the biggest thing and the biggest change in terms of like development this year is our players' response to adversity. Because I'm gonna be honest, in off season when we were planning on getting Vitio, we went and we got a bunch of references from him, and it might like those are the worst references I've ever gotten for a player. Um, and he's just broken all of the habits and patterns. Like Vito is just he's just a fucking machine. And personally, I think that he hasn't worked with players, no, with a coaching staff that was able to get the best out of him before, in terms of helping his further development. Like they could put him on Corki and they could put him on Akali and Oriana, and he would do well. Um, but I think getting the best out of him, I think that's something we can do this year.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
And where do you get the confidence to do both those things? So the idea that you get references from someone and you're like, actually, no, I think all these references are wrong, or not wrong, but they show a different thing. Or even you come into the first week, you go 0-3 and you have the confidence to say, right, we're still on the same track. Because I think, I mean, we can even talk about Vitality in previous years. I think maybe struggle with this, but KC, I think struggle with this as well, where there's so many outside pressures and maybe even so many voices going on behind the scenes that we try this thing and then it goes badly, so we change everything and try the new thing, and then that goes badly, and then by that point you're already 2 weeks in, you're already 0-6. It's like it's already pretty much impossible. So how do you get the confidence to stay, okay, these references might mean certain things, but it will be different for us? Because the reverse is definitely true as well. Everyone thinks that they're going to get Bo or whoever it is, and suddenly he's going to be like LPL Bo, but in the LEC. So where's it come from?
So for me, it comes from whether or not our bad reference person or trouble person is a mid or jungle player. If he is, I'm incredibly confident in my ability to be a positional coach on those two roles. If the guy wants to be the best, that's honestly what I'm mostly looking for. If the guy is driven, then I'm happy. And VTO might be, outside of Enuya, the most driven person I've worked with. This guy is incredibly driven. The other thing is the confidence comes from knowing that our preparation is good and that our game understanding is good and that our plan of development is good. And those things, if you haven't had a lot of past success, can be really fucking hard. But we've won a couple of championships, and we have done that without actually mastering all of like sort of our playbook or approaches to League of Legends, which means that basically Mac and I know that as long as we can get our team to certain points of viewing the game the same way that we do, we know that we can be good enough to be good in Europe. And now our goal is obviously to check off all of those things that we associate with being good at League of Legends. So going back to how we felt confident after week one was because we could honestly check off a lot of the fundamentals that we view are required to be good at League of Legends. Like some fundamentals are just necessary before you can start adding mid late game set pieces or communication systems. And that's anything from like, your level 1 setups, your early laning, your early pathing, how you path around priors, how you match enemy jungle, when you have to mismatch, when you prioritize Drake over Grubbies, like sort of making sure that the team develops in a way where all of them view those early fundamentals exactly the same way. And we felt that even after week 1, we were on the right steps there. So I think that's what allowed us to remain confident and sort of keep developing the team in the same trajectory that we had already put. I think that if we had gone in and lost the first 3 games and we had not been confident that our fundamentals were on the right pace, we probably would have been really stressed.
Mm.
But from having success in the past, we saw a lot of the things that are required that we consider required to be like a good team in Europe. We saw our team steadily getting there.
Yeah, and having a system or a process or a way of evaluating the results based on stuff that you know already going in. It's not like we're retroactively looking back at the game and finding things that we did well. We know these are the things that we're kind of checking against, and it's not just, did we win or lose? Did we look good or not? Did the casters say nice things about us or not? Like, it's actually based on specific things coming in.
Yeah.
One of the things that I saw fairly recently, which I'd just like to get your opinion on, is a podcast with a guy called John Danaher, who is a Brazilian jiu-jitsu coach, and he's potentially the best Brazilian jiu-jitsu coach. That might be a controversial statement. I know more about him than I know about the sport because I just love listening to him.
Nice.
But he basically, there's their version of the World Cup or something, and something like 2 years before, or maybe within 2 years, or maybe even within a year, their whole team kind of blew up. They managed to keep their best fighter, who was sort of the greatest of all time, but they got loads of new people, including people who'd never competed in that exact discipline before, and people from kind of all over, and people who are like really new. And then when they went, they had something like the most successful team performance ever. So like within a year or something. And he was talking about this, and one of the things that he was asked was, what do you think about the kind of sports psychology side of things? Because you've got people who've never fought in this way who come out really confident. Like, how are they confident? And he basically said, it's not that he doesn't believe in all the sports psychology stuff, but he's saying we treat confidence as a skill. So if they are learning a new move, I first have them learn it against complete beginners, people who they could beat with one hand tied behind their back doing normal things. So instead they have to do this new move against them, and then you gradually work up to people who are amateurs, people who are semi-pro, and by the end you're trying to do the move on Gordon Bryan. It's like you're trying to do the move against Faker. And so by the time you actually are in the competition, it's like, well, I've done this against the best, so why would I not be confident? Now I think when that works it sounds great, but I feel like there's some holes in that. But what do you think about that in the terms of, you were saying you're confident in your ability with jungle and mid, so as long as the person is driven and as long as you have a good assessment of their potential skills, the fact that other people might say, well, I'm also confident in how I coach mid laners and I think there's a problem, like how do you resonate with that, or do you think there's like lots of holes in it, or what?
I resonate with that a lot. I think there's an extra element to it, right? I think there's the human side to it as well, right? Because I think the big thing for like the biggest difference like with this being successful or not is it's not just like, because everyone can look at VTO and Bo and tell that they're really fucking good at the game. And that's easy, right? Like that's why Keiko went with Bo for this season, because he's really good at the game. Um Now, for me, what is important is to understand what made him not successful. Like, why was VTO kicked from 2 teams in a year? And is it within my skill set to fix those things? And I think that from an in-game point of view, I'm super sharp. I'm good at these 2 roles. But from an outside of role in the game and in developing human beings, I'm better. Like this is what I'm the best at. So honestly, after having 2 interviews with him, it became really apparent to me that this guy just needs a really firm hand and he needs feedback when he's overstepping boundaries, and he's just testing boundaries. And no one has set any for him in the past. Not a single one has set any boundaries for him. and once that was sort of established, then like then helping him develop his communication skill was very similar to what you just described. In the first, he was testing boundaries with me, and I'm easy because I can be any difficulty opponent. I can be amateur, I can be semi-professional, or I can be faker. And I can sort of choose that, which meant that I got to spend a lot of time with him during the boot camp, where we would just talk conflict over and how we would manage conflicts and how we would manage heavy discussion and what it meant and the impact of what heavy discussions have on your teammates if you're not in a good personal situation with them already. So by the time we started scrims, we had already test ran a bunch of these like situations. And as soon as he was getting feedback on these things, he just picked up it immediately. So it's not that he's master of communication or body language or tone of language yet. He still has a fair way to go, but his development has been so apparent. To the point where like normally I need two splits or a full year to determine whether or not I believe a player is capable of what I need in 3 years. And in 3 years I need someone who's good enough to compete internationally. And I would say that like I am like 90% convinced that V2 is that. Because of the way that he responds to adversity, the way that he responds to feedback, the rate at which he develops in basically anything you give him. He's just incredibly smart.
And how much does it mean to you when he's been really public about the work that you're doing with him and doing like tweets about it and that kind of thing?
I mean, it's always nice to get some kind of recognition, but the most important part for me is how he shows his gratitude to me, because the thing is, whoever I work with, whoever I work with, I will give them the same amount of love and hours. They will get the same amount. Um, and respond like this, depending on how they respond to the hours I put in and the affection I show them. That's how good we'll be as a duo. And it's very very easy working with him because like we have like there's some crazy, like he's crazy driven. Like he had one situation in scrim where I had to call him out like really aggressively. I had to call him out because he was being really rude. And this was before I had learned whether or not I should take him one on one or in a group setting. So I called him out in front of all 5 players. I came into a review and I said, I'm really sad because this review there are so many good things to look at, but we're gonna have to spend the first 10 minutes talking about your standards in this game." And I highlighted some of his standards that had completely dropped off for different reasons. And his knee-jerk reaction was to fight back. So that's when I learned my lesson of I'm gonna have these one-to-one because otherwise they're gonna turn into full-out fights in a big group scenarios, and these can be really hurtful for the team. So what ended up happening was that I grabbed him one-on-one afterwards, and I gave him some really harsh feedback that like these are not the standards that we have agreed on. When you communicate with your teammate like this, you're basically robbing him of your entire joint bank account. You're now down to zero, and next time you have a fight like this, it's gonna turn really bad. So I need you to first of all go and apologize to this guy. I need you to make sure that we put in some money into the bank account so we can withdraw at a later point. And I need you to keep to the standards that we have agreed to you keeping on because this was so far below it. Um, and and he was so emotional. He was so sad, and that hurt my heart a lot. But it took him 1 second. He was sad, and then he thanked me for the feedback, so he could become a better player. And I was that was a crazy experience. Because this guy just wants to be the best. And usually, what works really well for people who are driven like this is phrasing things in a way of what you are doing right now is not helping you win worlds or win LEC or become the best mid laner or become the best player. And he's responded incredibly well to that. So it's just been super gratifying working with him. He's always like he just wants to get better, and as long as I'm helping him get better, it's just a very rewarding job for me to have.
That's great to hear. One of the things you mentioned there, which I'd like to get onto, don't know how deep we'll go into this topic because I'm assuming we can talk about it forever. But you mentioned a few times about being good internationally. But the first place that I'd like to start is maybe I was going to say we're starting to get more comfortable with this idea of a 2-year plan, but maybe that's not even true. But let's pretend that we are. Now you guys are starting to talk about like 3 years. So again, as much as you are happy sharing, what is your sort of 3-year steps? And then we can get on to the actual end goal and stuff as well.
First plan is to join a team where we can have freedom to do two things: establish a winning culture, according to how Mac and I view it, and establish a roster that has all of the pieces that is needed to be good internationally. So that's I'll elaborate a bit on that. So first of all, we need a full roster that can buy into the sort of culture that we want. Like failing is a great tool to learn. Communication skills with each other, and being able to transfer knowledge and listen openly to each other. Um, Working hard, not being late, and being hungry and humble, which is like sort of the big one for us, because we've had players in the past where you win LEC and it sort of felt like they reached their goal, like they were done. So finding a constellation of 5 players that are hungrier than LEC, and then building a roster that complements that, which sort of leads into what we talked about before of having a mixture of personalities, but also sort of like role players and carry players within the roster. So ideally, you have a carry role and a support role in top jungle. Like they can be either. You can have a supportive jungler or you can have a supportive top laner. Then there has been sequences where having a supportive mid laner has been successful for rosters. If we think back to Doinb and how successful he was, but for the majority of mid laners that has been successful internationally over like the last 8 years, the majority have been carry players. Even though I guess you could probably argue that Faker is a bit of everything. But when it really matters, Faker has typically been a carry player. We can think back to some of the shuffles on his Azir, even at this Worlds. Then you absolutely need a carry player on the ADC role, and you need a supportive role on the support role. So those are like sort of like the team constellation. What we've ended up with, like for now, which is not necessarily the final roster in 3 years, is a carry top laner, a supportive jungler with the ability to play carry junglers, hopefully, eventually, a carry mid laner, a carry support, and Hilly-san. And within that roster, we currently have Hilly as the team captain, a role that is like very new even for us to develop, because we haven't actually worked in captaincy like thinking before this year. Like we've soft done it in the years before. Last year it was not something that was doable for us because of the roster constellation and the way that our players were in constant minus on their joint bank accounts. But this was one of the big requirements that Mac and I had looking for a team to split, which is one of the big reasons why we ended up sorting Casey off pretty early on. Because they were very intent on getting Bo and Upset as like the 2 missing pieces to the roster, which we felt wouldn't suit what we were looking for. So we got Hilly for Vitality, which is the first big step in like sort of our new paradigm for how to build a roster that is going to be long term good, is having a captain inside of the game, who can teach, who can direct the way that we play the game together with the coaches. So rather than me and Mac deciding how we play League of Legends, we can now go through Healy consistently, or Healy can go through us with backup in a way to make sure that at some point during this year we're gonna play exactly the same League of Legends and we're gonna view it the same way. And that's the goal for year one. Year one is establishing the culture, a winning culture as we see it, and establishing a way of seeing the game in different metas jointly. So that's year one in terms of like developing how we view League of Legends and establishing a culture. The second part of that is figuring out during year one whether or not the pieces that we have currently will fit into the scheme of being good internationally in 3 years. And all of this we have no way of knowing yet because we need to stress test them in best of three, best of five. How are they reacting when they're 0-2? How are they playing when they're 2-0? When they go international, like how are they coping with going to Worlds, being in a little hotel room for like a full month, playing on non-ideal setups? Can they keep their routines up? Can they keep playing well? Are they able to peak when it really matters? What is their relationship to their Asian overlords? Are they do they believe that they can eventually beat them, or do they show up with a mindset of, oh, I just got fisted by a showmaker, I'm so sad now? Um, so that's sort of the next part of year one. Like development is figuring out like how do we see our player slot into to competing internationally at a high level in year two, and especially in year three, which is when we realistically want to be good. Uh, so that's it. That's where we are currently. Year two is then gonna be if there has to be roster changes. Roster changes like ideally, and this is a big thing, right? Because a lot of the time you see roster changes being like 2 3 players, and whenever you change 2 or 3 players, you have to go back to year one. Like you cannot continue on year two. So even though you retain players and you retain coaching staff, you are now back in year one because you have to spend the first year, learning the game together. So hopefully, realistically, we are changing 0 players, 1 player, or maximum 2 players. That would be year one plan.
I think captaincy is something that we will see more and more in esports. It's something that I've always been passionate about just because of the background that I've had. I mean, the two sports that I played to, well, two of the sports that I played to a sort of semi-competitive level when I was growing up was rugby and football. And actually, the
Nice.
biggest thing that not actually a decent level, make that clear.
Same.
I was never going to go pro in any of these games, but just like sort of county-ish level. Um, One of the big things that I noticed a lot, even with the comparison of those two, is that in rugby, the captain role is much more defined and it's much more sort of specific. So you have a captain's run before your game, which is normally like the last training session ends with the captain leading it, kind of thing. And captains would be at least somewhat involved in some of the decision making. And I think that's a part that has been really successful when I started doing it very later on in my career with teams. The idea that someone has the privilege of being involved a bit in, like you said, how we're actually going to play the game, and they can have their opinion on that. But then on the flip side, they have the responsibility of, once we decide on a direction, they have to be the first port of call to like let everyone else kind of buy into that. And I think we'll just see it more and more, and a differentiation. It's great when they also are your leader in game, but as you mentioned with this book that you were talking about before, the captain class, it doesn't necessarily need to be like the loudest person who talks the most and who's non-stop talking in the game. It can be just someone who's most fitted for what exactly you want for the role. So just like with how you judge your team performance, like knowing what we want from our captain role and knowing how we're going to judge that, I think will become more and more standard. So it's great to hear that it's been being useful.
Yeah, it's been super useful, and like I said, this book really opened our mind that like we were sort of thinking about where we're gonna find a sort of a captain figure like this, because they honestly don't exist in esports yet, which just led us to the conclusion of we have to start creating them. We have to start helping players develop like the skill sets required to be a good captain. um and I think, you like you said, right, like esports is still in incredibly early days. So like, and sometimes I think we forget this, especially when you're so close. You feel like, oh, I've been here for 10 years, esports is old, but esports is so young. Like we are hundreds of years behind.
Mm.
um and that's why we take so much inspiration from traditional sports, right? Because like there's some pretty big consistencies in the most successful teams across like history in different sports, that they all do. So anything we can take away from that and sort of implement into esports is at least worth trying.
Mm. And one of the things that ties into my next question, one of the things we see a lot with a lot of the success stories, not necessarily all, but a lot of the success stories that we see in sport is this big focus on culture and attitude almost over talent. So the examples that are closest to my heart from rugby would be the All Blacks. They have this book Legacy, which is showing how much they put a focus on it. No dickheads was one of their rules. Or
No,
I can't remember who said it, but it was like I'd rather have a hole than an arsehole in my team.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and again, there was a famous story with the England team before they at the World Cup previously, before they won the World Cup. They basically ended up getting rid of a lot of their best players because the coach sat down, Clive Woodward, and said, but he basically gave everyone a chance, saying like your behaviour is unacceptable, and if they didn't change, then they got rid of them, even though it was all their best players. But
yeah.
I would say this with a caveat of two things. Firstly, actually doing that is very difficult, getting rid of your best player because you think that they're negative on the environment. But also, how do you balance, even when you're scouting and when you're looking for players, like the priority on either of those things? Because it could be that the best roster that you can put together for attitude and a winning culture, that it is true that some people just won't be able to compete internationally based on talent. Well, firstly, do you agree that that's true? And secondly, how do you balance if it is true?
I think there's sort of like when you go and scout players, I think the easiest thing to do is go and find people with good hands. Like there's an infinite amount of people with good hands. Like one thing that we even started considering doing is just looking for the best hands in other sports. Like go and watch the best Fortnite players. You know, Jojo Pun from I don't know where he plays now actually. C9 maybe.
Yeah,
Uh,
C9, yeah.
yeah. He played Fortnite beforehand. So I think like finding people with good hands is the least of our troubles. But finding people that can slot in like personality wise, especially in the captaincy roles, right? Like finding people that are that can compute in that role is much harder. Which means that it requires a much bigger effort in terms of scouting because you have to do multiple rounds of interviews to sort of get a grasp on the players, and you have to get multiple different opinions because sometimes you'll have a player who's just really good at interviewing, but not very good when it comes to practice. I think one of the good examples we've had, like that, we've always had like really good interviews with Takamas, for example. Not saying that he's a bad player, but he certainly doesn't fit the role that we are looking for in the support role. With him not communicating in game and but having a big opinion outside of the game. So I think making sure that you figure out sort of like all of these things, how people interact with each other, making sure that you get enough references, because we got so many bad references from Vito that we literally had to go and ask people, okay, like you labeled a lot of the bad things that he does. Can you tell me some of the good things? Like can you can you tell me when he's working, when he's not stressed, when he's not, being impossible to work with, like what does this guy look like? So it requires a much bigger effort on you as an organization and as a management to go and make sure that you do your due diligence on these players. Get point of view votes, right? Get votes from them. Make sure that you get votes of them stomping a game, having an even game that they're winning, having an even game that they're losing, and having a game where they're getting stopped. Because very often when teams get votes from players, they just get like, here are my top 5 pentakills. But and those are really not very useful, because they don't show you anything about how this player is reacting in game when he's stressed. Um, so short answer is you have to do a lot more background check. You have to do a lot more. You have to work a lot more to find all of the things that will tell you whether or not this player will fit into your systems. And then like you said, we this this whole thing you talked about, like rather a hole than an asshole. There's like we've seen this from football as well. Like Jurgen Klopp has a no asshole policy, like zero asshole. If you're an asshole, you're out. You cannot work for my team. And Greg Popovich, NBA coach as well, similar story, like no asshole politics. And that's one that we adapted this year. This year we have also implemented a no asshole policy. which meant that we had to do a lot of background checks and conversations and references and cross references for Vizio, because the references we initially got was that he was an asshole. But with the due diligence that we put in, we found out that he was an asshole. But most team wouldn't have put in the same amount of effort, and they would have labeled him as an asshole, and he wouldn't have been hired.
I think that's such a good kind of call out, that so much of it does just come down to you've got to do the work. Like you've got to put the time in. And the thing that I always say with kind of interviews as well is that a lot of people approach interviews with, maybe they have a list of questions, and then they will sort of the classic one is like to rely on your intuition, which
Yep.
I think it has some benefits, but I also think that we have to really think about what our intuition even is. One of my favorite examples talking about intuition is that there was a point where in an interview, Magnus Carlsen said there was a point in his career where he stopped trying to think about the game so much and instead just started to rely on his intuition. And people often take that as like, oh, intuition's amazing. And it's like, it is absolutely amazing, incredible thing. But by that point, think about how many chess positions he's seen. Like he's been playing chess since he was like 4 years old. At that point, he has seen so much. He's got so much data that's gone in to build up these intuitions. And if people come into the first time they're doing interviews, or they've only interviewed, 50 people, which sounds like a lot in esports, but it's really not a lot. Maybe if you've got 20 years experience as a hiring manager for a global company, you can say, I'm going to start relying on my intuition. But I think your intuition is actually based on when you interact with people normally, and it's about whether you would be friends with them or not. And that's where we can see all these like biases creep in. So even coming into an interview with thinking, this is how I will judge this interview, and having whatever you want to do. I mean, the thing that I proposed last time when I was talking to someone about this was these kind of scorecards. You get these in like art exams or language exams, where you have like these 5 boxes on your one thing. So you can have accepting of mistakes. And on one end, it's like, first response is always to talk about other people when you ask them about bad situations in previous teams. And on the other end, first response is instantly, these are the things that I did wrong, but also then it turns out I wasn't being paid, or so, stuff like that. So, but it just takes time, and it's just work that you've got to put in.
It does, for sure. And I would say, like, in the end, even after all of the work, we still use intuition, because your gut feeling, especially with like the more experience you get, is gonna tell you something that your eyes don't always see. And I think that's been good for me for the most part.
Yeah, the balance between the two, I think, is crucial.
Yeah, for sure.
So coming on to this, good internationally question. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. Maybe I'll keep it as broad as possible. And I think I can guess your answer, but I'd like to hear extra detail on it. How can EU win Worlds?
How can EU win Worlds? It starts with believing. You have to believe that you can beat them. We see this all of the time. Like, my favorite analogy to this is, I think, like, up until the 1980s or 70s, like the 100-meter sprint, it was never below 10 seconds. Like, it was impossible, and it was globally renowned as impossible to break the 10-second barrier. You couldn't do it. And then one guy did it, and then within the same year, 3 other people did it. So what it really comes down to is belief. And one of the big things that I've seen, and even though players will tell me that that's not how they feel, that's certainly what I have observed, is that people just don't believe. They don't believe that they can beat the Asians as of right now, and because they don't believe that they can beat the Asians as of right now, they're not beating them. Not that belief is all it takes, but it's the first step. Because when you go to an international, there's a few things, right? Like, there's a few things that held us back in the past. So last year, like we talked about, the big issue was that our bank account was in perma minus. When the team didn't really want to play together, we didn't really like each other on like a personal level a lot, and it meant that by the time we got to Worlds, we had spent 10 months together every day except one day a week. And work days are long and our work weeks are longer. So if you keep spending time with people that you don't like, you're gonna get really tired of them. Um, which meant that by the time we arrived at Worlds, I don't think a single person believed that we could win Worlds. And I think that a lot of people were thinking about what they were doing next year. Um, which is why a multi-year plan is necessary. Like I would like for once to go into a world and not have two players whose contract is running out and their next team is dependent on how well they do at Worlds, so they can go to another team and go to Worlds again. Um, and this is one of sort of the big traps that we end up falling into, is that like we are not thinking long term enough. So like it happened in 2021 with Humanoid and Kasi. Like their contract ran out after they had the best year of their life, and we literally couldn't retain Humanoid. It was impossible for us to retain him. Um, so making sure that you have a roster that you believe in, and year one is sort of a testing year. You change one, maximum two players. Once that is done, it's really crucial that they are signed in a time frame where when you go to Worlds on your year two, that no one is thinking about where they are going year three, because all of them should be thinking about how we are getting better as a team in year three. And then it's up to the players themselves and the coaching staff, right, to make sure that we help them sort of establish a belief that we can win. Because that for me has been the biggest downfall so far. So
Mm.
helping the team believe that they can win, finding a way for us to like each other. That when we go to boot camps, because you see it not just from my team. It's not just that Mad Lions went to Worlds and we didn't like each other. You go to Worlds and you see so many stressed teams, so many teams that are on the edge, so many teams that are tired of playing with each other, and it makes a lot of sense because they spend a lot of time together. So that's certainly one of my goals, is to get to a point where when we go to Worlds, everyone is there to get the best out of Worlds together, with no one thinking about their own performance individually, but rather as a team.
Mm.
And I believe that if you're capable of doing that while having an extra or two extra years to follow up on that sort of engagement in Worlds or sort of approach to Worlds, that's when we will see teams grow together. That's what we've seen from G2, I believe. So I think that that's absolutely crucial to give yourself your best chance at performing well.
Mm. I really like this shift to 3 years rather than two as well, because I've thought the same, but kind of from a little bit of more of an outside perspective. I think there's a role that it seems like you guys are doing as coaches, but I would say often it doesn't necessarily need to be the coach. As someone who's more concerned with the long-term strategy and is more working with the coaches. Different sports call it different things, but thinking that same sort of thing of like, okay, long term is really good, but on the other hand, our sort of interview process will never match what we could see from just spending a year with them. So the idea being that this 3 years means that we get a whole year to know exactly what we need to change, and then we get our 2 years. So that I think that's you're definitely right. Like this is where so much of the stress comes from. Is like, not only are you at Worlds in a new environment and all that kind of thing, but you can't enjoy it because everyone's just thinking about the next time. One of the
Yeah.
questions I have is sort of how do you start to get people to believe? Because it's quite strange for me, really,
Yep.
that analysts and people thinking about the scene and often coaches have such little belief in this in a way. Because if you compare it to examples from sport, there's been way more crazy things have happened than this. Like I don't know, we use an example from before. So England winning the World Cup, I think at that stage, no Northern Hemisphere team had ever beaten a Southern Hemisphere team in anything. Or Sky winning the Tour de France, no British rider had ever won or even come close to winning. Yet EU has come second at Worlds twice. They were the favourites going into Worlds once, arguably, with G2. So it's not that far away to win one more best of five. And yet it's still this like, no, it will just absolutely never happen. So how do you get people to actually kind of really believe rather than just say they believe because they know that's what you want to hear?
So I think it comes from your approach to anything, right? It starts with G2. It starts with believing you can beat G2. It starts by believing that when you go into a scrim block versus G2, that sure at the beginning of the year you can get fisted, you can get destroyed by G2. But similar to all failures, right? Like what matters when we fail or we lose a mid lane matchup or we fuck up a dragon sequence or a national sequence versus a good team is how we respond, right? Do we respond by saying, "Oh, G2 is just a better team than us," or do we go and take a look at one, what we did wrong, and two, what they did right, and then learn from that sequence? And if you opt into the second option, well, then you put yourself in a position to learn. And if you have 5 players that are willing to learn in adversity and through failure, well, then you can put yourself in a position where you can believe that when you run into a similar situation the next time versus this team, that you have the ability to beat them in this sequence. And the same goes for worlds. You go to worlds, and if your mindset is if your mind is so fragile that once you go into a scrim block versus Faker and you lose versus T1, well, then you're not going to learn a lot from worlds, and you're not going to believe that you can beat them. But what we would try to like, sort of what we would try to foster is an attitude of, okay, we're going to go into worlds, and for the first 5 days or 7 days of scrims versus Asian teams, it might be really rough, but that's okay as long as we learn everything we humanly can from this scrim block, whether it be laning matchups, early game pathing, team fighting, Drake setup, Nasher setup. What are they doing in order to stop us from winning games? Which has been a big theme for us because I've like all of the times I've gone to Worlds, I would say that by the end of Worlds, when we are scrimming Asian teams, you are matching them 50-50 in early games. Like it's literally 50-50 on all of the teams I've gone with. Where it's less than 50-50 is very often about the around the Dragon Soul, Nasher defense and Nasher push, where they seem to have our number, which is okay for now, as long as we learn why they have our number as a team. And this sort of leads into again the 3-year plan of going like in a dream world, I go to Worlds with Vitality this year and we win. But from a realistic point of view, we go to Worlds this year and we soak up as much knowledge as we humanly can, and we apply that for the entirety of next year. And then we go to Worlds and we have a better performance and we win Worlds, or we go to quarters, or we go to semifinals, and you repeat that same pattern. And by the year that you go to Worlds year 3 with the same fucking roster, or with 1 or 2 changes, that's when you start competing. That's when you are able to win. That's when you are able to beat them. Um, but it takes a long time, and that's something that is a hard sell to upper management, to casters, to the public narrative, even to your players at times. But that's how I view it, at least.
Yeah, it's such a powerful shift, though, in the way that you're thinking about even the practice, because if practice is almost a test of where we're at, these scrims when you first get to Worlds, then no wonder it's exhausting and it's sort of deflating. Yet if it's we're going to come and be sponges and learn loads of new things, then it's exciting. It's like, okay, what else are we going to be shown? And suddenly that shift seems like quite a small shift, but it can massively affect the energy levels, which then affects the learning, and then it just snowballs again. Like there's so many of the things that we talked about that sound like really small changes, but if you do them properly and you do them consistently, they just snowball into absolutely massive differences.
Yeah. And I actually think I've seen this like across the board, like across the years I've been here. And I've also seen why it hasn't worked. Like year 1, when we went to MSI with Yo-Yo and Jungle, like he got fisted, he got destroyed. Like all of MSI, until like the very late stages of scrims when we started going even, like we've done in all years. Like he was getting annihilated. Like he was getting outpathed every game. But by the end of MSI, he could match them. And last year with Chasey, we played a lot of scrim games versus BLG with Bin as like the renowned best top laner that year in Worlds. Like by the end of World scrims, like Chasey was getting lane leads versus Bin consistently in counter matchups, and was going even or soft losing in losing matchups, which is like massive because when we first got here, he was getting fisted on both sides of the matchup. Which lets me believe that like if players have enough time with their positional coaches, or if they're good enough themselves, like you can learn how to match your lane opponent in lane, and that's where it starts. And if you can learn that, why shouldn't you be able to learn to match them in team fights or map movement or tempo resets or like whatever it is? But very often what we end up seeing is that we see these small changes, right? I see that Yo-Yo can keep up with the Asian junglers. I see that Chasey can keep up with Bin. I see that Niski might not be able to keep up with Showmaker this year, but he could keep up with Yagao, who plays very similar style League of Legends to him. But I don't get to see how those things translates into us being a better team next year because we have such massive roster changes.
Mm. I think it's such a good point. And like you said earlier, you change out two or three or more of your players and you're starting again. So we're just repeating this first year over and over again, even when the staff or the coaches either want to or are at least talking about multi-year projects. It's like, okay, but if you're you get to do multiple years of the same year over and over again, it's not quite as impactful. So I'm, we've gone for like 2 hours already, and I always start to get a little bit unfocused, so I let things go a bit all over the place. So I'd like to move to the like quickfire questions at the end, if that's all right. So
Of course.
we'll start with, who are the coaches or people that you look up to in your career, either now or when you first started?
So I would say the coaches I look up to is Jurgen Klopp. I think this guy, I've followed him since his Dortmund times, and I've now went back and like literally watched him play football and watched interviews from him when he was in Mainz and when he was a coach and he was a player. And I think that one of the big things that's really important for me as a person is that like I'm giga special. I'm quite loud. I actually don't have the biggest social drive, but I have a really big drive to have people around me be happy. That's my social drive. As soon as people is happy, I can bounce. I can listen to my audiobook and be by myself. But one of the big things for him is that he's basically always managed to be him. Like he's just always been himself throughout his entire career, and he stood by who he is as a human being. And I think that that's such a big thing. Like not having to wear a mask, not having to be someone else, just being able to be you. And I think that that's something that has inspired me a lot, and something that has made me stay with Mac as long as I have, because Mac literally just allows me to be me. And when I'm allowed to be me, I'm a pretty good coach. Mac is another inspiration. Like he brought me in and he taught me so much that added to the skill sets that I had as a coach, and now we're at a point where we are continuously still learning from each other, and I think that's a wonderful dynamic to have. For other inspirations is usually football players. Like I am incredibly inspired by Andrew Robertson from Liverpool, Scottish left wing back, who is renowned for not being the most talented player, not being the best at passes, not being the best at crosses, but being willing to work 10% harder than everyone else in his team or in the world. And he's also a cocky motherfucker, taunting Messi in their return game after losing 0-4 in first match, like stuff like this. Big attitude and willing to go the extra mile for his team. Any sort of players that fall into this category has already always pushed me very hard, because I have never been like is like particularly naturally talented in any way where I am just better than you at X because of whatever reason. So for the majority of how I approach life very much with a mindset of I will outwork you. I will work harder and I will work smarter than you. And players who fall into this category like James Milner, Jordan Henderson, Andrew Robertson, Steven Gerrard. Well, Steven Gerrard is also incredibly talented, but sort of these players have always pushed me really, really, really hard.
What's the biggest hardship you've experienced as a coach?
The biggest hardship I've experienced as a coach was my incompatibility. No, what is the word? Like English is hard. Uh, I was not very compatible with Ilyoya, and that was the hardest. that was the hardest hardship for me as a coach in my career so far, because I desperately wanted to have my relationship work with Yoya and be his positional coach, but on a personal level, um, we just didn't click in that regard, and I think that was really hard for my confidence at the time then, and it was really hard for the team because the team actually needed me and him to work well together, and we didn't. And it's not his fault, it's not my fault, but it was really hard.
And then what's your biggest highlight as a coach?
Uh, my biggest highlight, um, there's so many good ones. Um, I think my biggest highlight is I think winning LEC summer 2021, because it was so rough leading up to the finals. I think we lost like 17 scrim games in a row, and no one believed we could win at the time. And we were for the most part dead scared of Fnatic moving into the finals. But my job that for that particular series was to scout for Fnatic. Like that was when we still had cast, and I was the assistant coach. And basically, my job ended up being for the weekend to reassure everyone that we were a better team than Fnatic, and then we went and 3-1 them. And I think that I felt like, not in terms of an in-game point of view, but in terms of increasing the belief in the team that we could win. I think that was one of my most impactful like periods.
Well, yeah, I mean, from the outside, I wouldn't have guessed that you guys went into that game with a lack of confidence. That was the opposite of what I read it as by seeing. So you did a very good job there. What are 3 non-negotiable behaviors that you and people around you need to buy into?
No moaning or complaining. It's so boring. It's so easy. I like to live life on hard mode, and complaining and moaning is the easiest thing you can ever do. Um, no mind reading. This goes especially with when I'm positional coaching with my player, and even more so with my wife. And why I have such a good relationship with my wife is because if you ask me to guess your mind, I will guess wrong. I just will. I just will. There's a chance I can, but if you and I work together on increasing the way that we communicate and understand each other, we can skip so many pointless discussions. And the third one is, um, smile in the face of adversity. Um, because that's how I approach life. And if, especially when I work someone one to one, Vincent right now, this is probably the one that I repeat the most to him, because it's so easy getting upset when something bad happens to you. But we don't do things that are easy here, because that's not how you become the best.
Great. Last question. If you from today could give yourself one piece of advice when you first started your coaching journey, what would it be?
Oh, what would my coaching advice be? Um, Find the balance between working smart and working hard. Don't just work hard.
I think
Yeah,
it's
I killed myself. The first year, I killed myself in working hours and how much time I put into it, to the point where I was burned out when we got to Worlds. Not worth it, guys.
I think it's good to get the balance, you know, don't just work smart and not hard as well, like you're saying with
Yeah,
all the
definitely.
players. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I think it was really, really great. And thank you for being so open about things. I mean, you said near the beginning that people should be more open, and then you just absolutely led by example. So I hope other people follow in what you're doing, because I think it's definitely the thing that's going to take us forward as a region.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, John. Thank you for giving me a place to speak. It was very nice.
Yeah, great. Well, I've got loads more questions, so we'll have to do another one some other time.
For sure. For sure.